Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guests today are Barbara Hofer and Gale Sinatra, and their new book is Science Denial: Why It Happens and What to Do About It. A rather timely subject. Gale Sinatra is the Stephen H. Crocker Professor of Education and Psychology at the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California, where she directs the Motivated Change Research Lab. She received her BS, MS, and PhD in psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's been recognized by the American Educational Research Association for career achievements in research with the Sylvia Scribner Award. She resides in Altadena, California, where our offices are located. Barbara Hofer is Professor of Psychology Emerita at Middlebury College and is a Fellow of the American Psychological Association. She received her PhD in Psychology and Education from the University of Michigan and an EDM in Human Development from Harvard. She's a recipient of national awards for both research and teaching from the American Education Research Association and the American Psychological Association, and she lives in Middlebury, Vermont. So we talk about all the hot button issues, obviously in the middle of this pandemic, recording on August 6th, on vaccines, vaccine hesitancy, wearing masks. Are we going to have to socially isolate again? What does the science tell us about the Delta variant and vaccines, and how to talk to somebody who's vaccine hesitant? Much of the conversation is centered around these hot button current issues, but we also cover GMO hesitancy or denial and other, well, let's say, liberal denial of science. So it's not just going after conservatives who are vaccine hesitant, say, for example. And also evolution deniers, creationists, how to talk to them, and the relationship of science and religion, science and politics, how all these other issues, socially, culturally, politically, ideologically, interact with our understanding of how science works. And then we end with some recommendations: how to talk to a science denier, how to talk to your crazy Uncle Harry at the family dinner who has some idea about some conspiracy theory about vaccines or whatever. What should you say? What kind of questions should you ask? You have coworkers who don't want to get vaccinated, or your boss who's a climate denier. What do you do? What do you say? So their book primarily focuses on recommendations for educators, for consumers of knowledge online, for politicians, for anybody who is concerned about science denial. So I think this is one of the more important conversations we've had, because obviously we're living in the middle of this issue right now. All right, thanks for listening. And as always, if you appreciate the podcast, do support us at skeptic.com/donate. Your tax-deductible donations go to supporting the podcast, as well as the magazine and the society. Thanks for listening. Barbara and Gale, here's the new book, Science Denial: Why It Happens and What to Do About It. Indeed, this is a rather timely issue, and your book couldn't come at a more important point. Here we are the first week of August, and 30% or 40% of Americans are not only not vaccinated, but will never get vaccinated. And, it's just stunning. What can we do about this? And I'll just tell you, one little funny story. I was just at a conference with Mount Rushmore, Freedom Fest. It's kind of a collection of libertarian conservative types, and they bring me in to be the token science guy. And so I'm in this debate with these people about vaccines and masking and social distancing and so on. And the one speaker gets up and he opens with this story about the AIDS crisis back in the late 80s, maybe 89 or so. And he starts off with this article that was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the most prestigious medical journal in the United States. And this article said that AIDS virus could be spread in swimming pools, on buses, in elevators, just through the air by touching people and so on. And of course, we know this is not true. So I'm thinking, where's he going with this story? And he says, and the author of this paper is none other than Anthony Fauci. And the crowd goes wild, like, yes, you see, that guy is always changing his mind. He's a flip-flopper. What does he know? Why should we listen to him? So let's start there. What's wrong with flip-flopping? I mean, why is that a bad thing? Or is it? And should we listen to Anthony Fauci? And where do we go from there?
Well, as you know better than anyone, Michael, there needs to be science skepticism, obviously. But what is wrong with that whole argument is science evolves, information comes available, evidence comes available, and obviously we learn more over time. And you don't rest all your public health strategy on one paper. You rest it on a confluence of evidence over time, and that's how science works. You know that better than anyone. So that's what's wrong with that idea, that it doesn't change, and of course it does.
Yeah. And it points to just all the problems in the public understanding of science. Just the fact that people look back and they remember when we were washing our groceries when they came in the house, in April of 2020, that we were so careful because at that point we did not know what is the main source of transmission. And now people are not bothering to do that, but if they're reading the science and looking at the evidence, they're more and more careful about masks, which at that point they might not have been wearing. But we've learned, the science has evolved. It's a novel coronavirus, so the science has to keep evolving as we learn about it. And to call that flip-flopping is a just dramatic misunderstanding of science.
Yeah. Yeah, the word flip-flopping is always used in politics because I think we have a sense that if you're a liberal or you're a conservative, you embrace a set of core beliefs. I'm pro-life and I'm anti-immigration and I believe in flag and family values and so on and so on. And those are non-negotiable. So for somebody who says, well, I changed my mind about that, some, let's say, Republican senator or congressman who says, I think I'm going to join the other party or whatever, that's considered, almost sinful, right? You are a flip-flopper. You have given up our core values. And that's different than in science, where we think of empirical truths as, well, they are whatever they are. And if the evidence changes, well, then I'm just going to change my mind. And so I think we tend in our minds to treat political truths different than these scientific empirical truths.
But
Right.
even what you're describing as, quote, political truths are not necessarily so. And there are people for whom it is far more nuanced than I'm just going to subscribe to every single thing my party believes. I mean, for most people, that's not the case. And they do change their minds on issues. And I think the media leads us to dichotomizing those realities more than is actually accurate.
But you were talking about core values, Michael, and a core value of science is tentativeness, openness to evidence, and the willingness to change our minds. And even though individual scientists sometimes don't, they sometimes stick to their um, theory or their perspective, even when evidence is accumulating. It isn't about what the individual does, it's what the field of science does over time. And tentativeness is a value of science. Openness to change is a value of science. And so it's a different set of values than sticking to those core beliefs.
Yeah, Barbara, I think that's probably right. Probably in the quietness of their private minds and homes, people do change their minds about issues. Like maybe they become pro-choice without ever announcing, maybe to their group, I'm still a Republican or something like that. But I'm pro-choice rather than pro-life. So, but how many of those tenets could you give up and still call yourself a conservative or a Republican, say, or a liberal or a Democrat? I mean, I think Trump kind of changed that conversation. Like, if you're not a member of our team and agree with me on everything, then you're the enemy. And if you watch enough Fox News, that's kind of what it feels like. So I think that's your point about the media dichotomizing things.
Yeah. It certainly has
And then
made
the
it feel
strength
that
of
way.
identity.
Yeah.
Sorry. And then you're talking also about the strength of identity. And I saw an article the other day about those people in the Ozarks in Missouri who were going to get vaccinations in disguise. And the reason
Oh
why
my
is they didn't want
God.
their friends and neighbors to know, who
Yeah.
were anti-vax, that they had changed their mind. And so that shows you the tribalization, and people don't want to get kicked out of their group. And so people might be more willing to change their mind than their group is willing to let them.
But I've been heartened lately by the stories of the people in the last week who've gotten vaccinations. Right at the point that we all thought, well, we have fixed the movable middle. We've gotten people to change their minds who could, and now those other people maybe are never going to change their minds. In fact, There's a lot of that happening right now. And I think it's really encouraging to look at those stories and see why. And one of my favorites this week was a 25-year-old in Tennessee, I think it was in the New York Times or the Post, who said, I wasn't going to get vaccinated because I was afraid of infertility. My friends, my Facebook friends had all told me that you've got to really be worried about fertility. And she said, but then people around me were getting really sick and dying. And I thought, it's now time for me to read more about this. So she did her own investigation and she said, it was one thing to be skeptical. I value that, but it was another thing to be ignorant. And I don't want to be ignorant. And she went and got vaccinated and she was public about it and public with her friends. And I think those are the people who are going to help turn the tide for others.
Yeah, there was that story the other night on the news. I've been tweeting several of these that have been posted on ABC News and CBS News this week about conservatives who got the Delta variant and they're hospitalized. And these are guys like in their 30s and 40s with families. The one dramatic one, I think, is a 41-year-old man. And his his wife and his 6-year-old son are outside the glass looking in the window. And there he is, not intubated, but he had the oxygen mask and they got the microphone up to him and he says, well, I'm sorry I didn't get vaccinated, but, we're a strong conservative family and that's why I didn't do it. I'm like, what? This is crazy. I mean, the virus doesn't know if you're a Democrat or Republican, right? So what is he reflecting there about his identity when he says we're a strong conservative family and that's why we don't vaccinate?
It's a badge. I mean, they're wearing a badge of, this is who I am and this is what I do. And I love Gale's story about the people actually putting disguises on to go get vaccinated because they're so afraid of being outside the tribe. But that's a pretty ridiculous way. Again, it's overly dichotomized. I mean, it's a pretty ridiculous way to see the badge of identity, that you're going to die believing that, or you're going to die believing that it was a hoax. I mean, there are all those stories from early on where people would say, I know I'm sick and I'm dying, but it can't be COVID because COVID doesn't exist.
Right.
And I'm old enough to remember that Richard Nixon started the EPA, and then conservatives were pro-science in the past because science is an economic engine. Science solves problems. Science can make us stronger as a country in regards to defense and the economy. So I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't considered in fashion as a conservative to be against science.
And that science education was seen as a path towards that economic engine as well. And we have just stripped science education over the years.
Yeah, so that began with Sputnik and our concern about falling behind the Soviets in engineering and math and technology, particularly the space race and the missile gap that Kennedy ran on. Yeah, so, right, that was a Republican thing. Well, there was no Republican Democratic divide on science. It's all good. But what happened?
Yeah.
How did Republicans, become the anti-science group? Whether they are or not, polls are divisive about this. It's more of a focused. It's just this particular issue, climate or vaccines or whatever, that people focus on. But the image is that Democrats are the party of the science book, and Republicans are the party of the holy book, and we have this apparent divisiveness. When did that start?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues that Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway talk about in their book, Merchants of Doubt, which you've probably read, but the ways in which doubt got fomented by corporations. So this was the economic side of why we need to not believe in climate change. We need to prop up Exxon, and Exxon went and hired all these agents, PR agents, to try to sow doubt, to try to manufacture doubt, to make people believe that climate change wasn't really happening or it wasn't human caused or whatever, in order to feed the economy. And the same thing had happened with the tobacco industry. These same companies, same PR firms have been serving these interests. And that's, you think about the Koch brothers and what they had to defend in terms of fossil fuels. I mean, all of that then fed into a Republican story, I think.
But we also know that it isn't just Republicans.
No.
Anyone, liberals and independents, can also fall prey to science misinformation, to science doubt and resistance. And it isn't a both sides thing. There are, sort of more resistance on the right, but there's still resistance on the left. And that happens. And even ourselves, we can fall prey to misinformation. We can inadvertently share misinformation on Facebook if we haven't, taken the steps to vet it. So even we can fall prey to it. And then we talk about that in the book, is that it
And I think
isn't
that's, yeah.
for some people. It's all of us have to be vigilant.
And I think that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, is that we really wanted to make it clear that there are these underlying psychological explanations for why we can all be resistant, doubt, deny the parts of it that we want to. These are human tendencies. And once you understand that, once you can look at it within yourself, then it's a lot easier to figure out how to have conversations with others. And my favorite tale of this in the last week was, Michael, I'm sure you saw this article, the cover of the Sunday Times Magazine on GMOs. And just a wonderful piece looking at, is it time to love GMOs or not? And a friend who had just read the book sent it to me, a Vermonter humanist, who had been very anti-GMO. And she said, if I hadn't read your book, I wouldn't have read this article the same way. I mean, I really get now what my resistance had been and cognitively what the problems were. And I think that's enlightening to me, to think that people can become more aware of how they think and how they resist, and what is confirmation bias, what does it mean to have confidence through coherence, all those sorts of things, and then start to see their own patterns of reasoning. And that helped her talk to other people.
So the GMO issue is more of a liberal denial of the science, right? That's kind of how it's often characterized, because it's not natural, or I don't know what the arguments are.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's fun because I don't know if either of you read the comment section on that New York Times piece, but I love reading how people begin to interact afterwards. And there are 950 comments that followed that article. But one person said, oh, yeah, all those GMO deniers are the same people who deny climate and the same people who don't get vaccinated. And everybody poured back like, no, 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 no. The hardcore left were saying, I am vaccinated. I do know about climate change, but there's no way I'm putting a GMO modified food in my body. And
oh my God. Right.
But there's
right.
They tend to conflate. They conflate things like pesticide use, or they conflate, big ag. And there are problems with pesticide use, and there are problems with mega farming and big agriculture. And I think that's one of the problems with GMO resistance, is there's confusion about what you're actually resisting. And we know from our own research that people don't understand what GMOs are. That's just a regular, science misunderstanding. They think they're clones, or they think that they inject things in them. They don't know exactly how genes are modified. One of my favorite stories there is you see labeling for GMO salt.
GMO-free salt.
GMO-free salt. Yeah. And, it's non-GMO. Well, salt is a rock. It doesn't have genes, so it hasn't been genetically modified by anyone. So there's a real confusion about what does a GMO actually mean. And then to say, like Barbara said, well, I won't put GMOs in my body. Well, you're putting GMOs in your body every day if you've eaten anything that hasn't been near corn. All corn in the United States has been modified, and even kale is a genetically modified food at its origin, right? So, it's hard for people to understand those things. They conflate a lot of things together. So part of it is just your basic misunderstanding of the science itself, which is understandable. It's confusing, and it's difficult stuff.
But living in Vermont, which was the first state to pass a law to get everything labeled, and then the federal government overrode that, very quickly. But I followed these conversations with a lot of interest, because I really do know that there is, for most of us, a difference between thinking cross-pollination, cross-fertilization of plants is one thing, but it's another to say, I'm going to put fish genes into the strawberries so that they don't freeze. I mean, that does make people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not surprising. And yeah, Frankenfish. And there's a lot of Frankenberries, because it's the fish genes going into the strawberries. I mean, it's just, I think those things are far more understandable. That is not what's been happening for generations. That is something very new that's happening in the lab. And I think Gale's work on emotion and how emotion affects reasoning about these things. Do you want to talk about the fear that comes from that, or?
Well, absolutely. There's this resistance to, things that are unnatural, but that stems from, some good evolutionary history, right? We should be skeptical to eat things that, sort of naturally
Yeah,
gross us out. There's a reason for that because many of those things were toxic to us. Many of those things could have been harmful
yeah.
to us. So there is good reason, as Barbara said, to be suspicious and concerned about something that you put into your body. That said, there's the conflation and confusion is rampant about what GMOs actually are and how regular, standard practices of modifying foods to be more drought tolerant, for example, is not gonna hurt you. And you've been eating them for decades, by the way. So there's that.
But the cross species issues are another thing. I think there is reason, or even, the story in the New York Times about the purple tomato that was going to have these healthy properties of antioxidants by crossing it with a snapdragon. Well, as many people have pointed out, snapdragons and tomatoes would not naturally cross fertilize. You really have to do this in a lab to make this work. And there are reasons that makes people uncomfortable. And I think the bigger issue in Vermont was that many people were upset about Monsanto. You've got this big company coming in, patenting the seeds. It was illegal to save the seeds and replant them. I mean, we need to get rid of that. We need to get rid of the patenting on it. There were so many reasons not to trust Monsanto. It was a way to sell more Roundup. People who are growing organically don't want more Roundup out there. I mean, there were a lot of concerns, but it's really easy to extrapolate from that therefore they must be bad to eat. And that was a strange leap for people to make. Like, there are good reasons to worry about the farming practices that were affected and about growing monocultures and those sorts of things. But it's another to then say, therefore, it cannot be good for my body.
Well, I think that the conflation that you just articulated, Barbara, between the science and then the business and the marketing and the politics, that's what happens, right? And we see that with the vaccines. I've heard people say, I'm not going to get a vaccine. I don't trust big pharma. And so separating out the
Yeah.
science from what the science really says, from, marketing and the politics and business, those are sort of separate issues. Not that they're unrelated, but I think when people are doubling down on the political issue or the economic issue, they conflate a little bit of that with their resistance to the science.
Yeah, I think
One
here
of the
of
things we talk about in the book are all, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I was just thinking of Bill Maher, and who's pretty much in the middle of the bell curve of liberal politics and his positions on most things. And so every time he rants on about GMOs, the word Monsanto always comes in there. Vaccines also, just big pharma, big corporations. Don't trust them.
Yeah.
They only have their bottom line at just built in. It's baked into the DNA of corporate America. You have to live by the quarter in your stock portfolio and so on. And so they don't care about the effects of what they're producing 6 years from now or whatever. They're just based on the quarter. So we can't trust them. And so there, it's like, well, to what extent does the science even matter? So here, let me just ask you guys, since you've done research on this. So if you encounter somebody like an anti-GMO or anti-vaxxer or whatever, if you correct them and say everything you just said about GMOs, will they go, oh, okay, yeah, I was wrong. I now accept GMOs. Maybe not right there on the spot. Does it affect them later? Do they absorb it and then quietly change their mind, or what's the evidence on that?
I'll go back to this friend who emailed me about this, that having read the book, she listened to that article, read that article differently than she would have before, because she was paying attention to her own cognitive processes in a new way. So I think that kind of training may come first, is having us all take a little bit of a step back. And when we talk in the book about Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, and he talks about System 1 thinking as being this quick, intuitive response, rapid response to something, and the System 2 being the slower, analytical, thoughtful, more rational approach. And helping people try to calm down when they're thinking about this kind of stuff and employ System 2 is really critical. I mean, System 1 is great if you're trying to make quick decisions while you're driving, hurrah, you need it. But System 2 is better when you're trying to figure out, should I really inject bleach in order to address my COVID symptoms?
Right.
Maybe I need to slow down. Just because that guy said it might be a good idea and I trusted him, I think I need to look this up.
We know from our own research that people can shift their thinking about GMOs when misconceptions about them are upended, and we've done that kind of research in multiple studies. The key to that is not just to say you're wrong and everything you think is wrong, because of course people are going to be
That
resistant
doesn't
to
work.
that. The key to that is to explain what the science actually is. And when you provide explanations along with a refutation, you can get people to be more open and not only shift their knowledge about GMOs, but shift their attitudes and their emotions. Because the attitudes and the
Yeah.
emotions, if they're really negative, that's going to create its own source of resistance. So if you can shift all three, and we have done that in a couple studies, that's definitely opening to the kind of thing that Barbara said. They may not completely change their thinking that minute, but maybe they'll go read another article and maybe they'll be a little bit more open to that. So it does kick out one of the legs of the stool of
Yeah.
fighting the science.
Okay, although on the other side, I would say there are a number of people who don't eat GMOs because they say, well, there's no benefit to eating it. So, and there could be risk that we don't know yet. So why not be cautious until we know? And these are people who might look at that Fauci AIDS study that you talked about and say, see, that's what we knew at that point in time. And this is what we know at this point in time about safety in GMOs. But that could change this is still really new. What does it mean to track this over time? So I think there's some respect for that position. However, when that gets carried to the extreme of therefore we don't want any scientists to do any work on GMOs, and they went and trashed the rice fields in Indonesia where they were trying to grow the vitamin A rice, I mean, that's pretty horrific. There's a fine line there between saying, okay, I'm going to make some choices for my body while I wait for the science to catch up, and another that is, I don't want any of this research ever being done. It's heinous. It can't be supported.
Yeah. So if you run experiments or you have a group, and we all have anecdotes, people that do change their mind, people that don't change their mind. But statistically, with a large sample, if you set down a set of guidelines, here's what you should think about when you're confronting climate science claim or vaccine claim or whatever.
Yeah.
Or if let's just make this a PSA for the next time you have a family dinner and crazy Uncle Harry blurts out, the coronavirus was a Chinese hoax, or climate change is a Chinese hoax, or the election was rigged, or QAnon's real. What do I say? Do I just sit there and keep my mouth shut to make the peace, or should I ask questions? Should I say, no, you're wrong, or whatever? What do you recommend on how to talk to a science denier?
It's
Barbara,
really
you need to tell
hard.
your story about the person who came to your talk.
Oh yeah, I mean I can tell that, but I also was going to say I have a friend who's a doctor who said that in early November of 2020, her nurse said to her, "Oh, those cases we saw this week, we won't see any more after the election." It's all a hoax. And once the election is over, the Democrats won't need to be promoting anymore that there's this pandemic happening that she didn't believe was actually happening. And the doctor was consulting with me. What do I say to this person? How do I deal with this? I mean, those are big issues. These are happening all over the country right now. So I hope not that extreme, but I know many of them are that extreme. But the example Gale's talking about, I gave a public talk on science denial, and there was a guy in the room who was very, very quiet and then emailed me afterwards, and he said, I'm one of those people you were talking about. I don't believe in evolution. I think dinosaurs and people lived at the same time, walked on the earth together, and I'll explain to you why. And I certainly don't believe in climate change, that there's human causes or that, blah, blah, blah. So I thought, well, this is a chance to get together with someone and put in practice the kind of things we've been talking about in the book. And we had a lovely conversation, as strange as that is. It was trying to find common ground. So I guess what Gale and I are recommending is to try to really listen to what somebody else's beliefs and concerns are and where their values are behind it. And then realize that people are multifaceted. Even though he has a strong tribal identity as a religious person that aligns with all these beliefs that he has, he's many other things as well. He even has a bachelor's degree in science, which was surprising to me. But he softened when I said, "Do you have grandchildren?" And we began to talk about our grandchildren, and we had this really good talk about that. And I said, I care about the planet we're leaving them. I mean, I really care like what happens in the future. I care about what world they inherit. And he leaned forward and talked about, well, so do I. that really does worry me. And then he said, actually, what gets me about climate change is the economics of it. I just don't see how we're going to have the money to fight it. So it then we found common ground. We found a place to connect, and I think I've been collecting stories like this all over the country of people who are having conversations like this. As long as they're patient, wait, get to the core, figure out where they do have common ground, I think it's possible. Too optimistic for you, Michael?
I don't know. Well, I think it can work if you do that strategy you just talked about. That is to say, for example, on the evolution creationism issue, you have a whole chapter in that in your book. I won't give a creationist one of Richard Dawkins' books as a recommendation. I'll send them to Francis Collins and his book, The Language of God, which
who's got a religious.
Yeah. He's an evangelical, born-again Christian, head of the Human Genome Project, head of the National Institutes of Health. He's one of the most prominent scientists in the world of our generation. And he's on your team. And he says evolution happened. So there I'm kind of doing an end run around. No, this is not an atheist thing. This is a science thing.
Yeah, and I think climate scientist Catherine Cahill has been doing a lot of this as well, because she's an evangelical Christian who's a climate scientist, and she is just out there at the forefront helping people understand they can be both.
Yeah, and we've partnered in our own research with a couple of researchers from Arizona State, Sarah Brownell and Elizabeth Barnes, and they teach evolution to evangelical students by bringing in, just as you just said, Michael, and Barbara, an evangelical scientist who works in the area of evolution. And, that's that shifting identities back to the conversation that Barbara was just talking about with the science denier. If you can connect with them on a level that is an identity that's really important to them, and as a scientist who's evangelical, like Catherine, that's someone who can say, look, I'm a person of faith and I still accept this science, and here's why. That's going to be so much more compelling to students. And in our research, we've seen that really is a lever for people, and it opens a door.
Yeah, sort of a social proof idea from social psychology that a member of your team says it's okay, and that makes it more likely and acceptable. Here's what I wrote about this in my book, Why Darwin Matters. My only cover with full frontal nudity on it, by the way. It's a chimpanzee for those of you listening. So I have that, we reprinted William Jennings Bryan's closing statement at the Scopes trial, which he was not allowed to give, but he published it later. So we republished it in Skeptic as the kind of core reason why people deny evolution. He says the real attack of, this is 1925, the real attack of evolution, it will be seen, is not upon Orthodox Christianity or even upon Christianity, but upon religion, the most basic fact in man's existence and the most practical thing in life. If taken seriously and made the basis of a philosophy of life, it would eliminate love and carry man back to a struggle of tooth and claw. So somehow, people have this idea for a century now that if I accept evolution and Darwinism, that means I got to be an atheist. That means there's no grounding in moral values. That means there's no right and wrong. Anybody could do whatever they want. America will go to hell in a handbasket. Hitler got away with it. It's just a Nietzschean kind of world. And then all of a sudden, you're not talking about DNA and punctuated equilibrium or gradual evolution, or whatever. You're talking about something completely different.
I have to jump in with another story, because there was a point where I knew all of that, but I don't think I really grasped it until I interviewed someone who was like that. And this was 25 years ago. I was interviewing college freshmen, and on epistemic cognition, and one of the sets of interview questions was about evolution. And I was seeing them at multiple time points over their first semester of college. And at the interview right before Thanksgiving, I had a student come in who I'd seen before, and they were all science majors. But this was fascinating to watch which ones were religious and science majors and what was happening to them in the process of college. So when I asked him about evolution, at this point, he just stumbled and was just so uncomfortable. And, he was learning about the evolution of antibiotic resistance and that sort of thing in his biology class. And so he was starting to understand, I want to be a doctor. I need to know this stuff. But then he told me how upset he was about going home for Thanksgiving, because he said If I believe that, who will I be? And that was just this profound recognition. He said, I don't want to go home. I don't know how to talk to my pastor anymore. I don't know how to be with my parents. I know what they believe. And this was what I was raised to hold as truth. But now I'm in these classes where I'm understanding that religion deals with one sphere and science really answers other kinds of questions. And I'm going to need to know that and to support that. So I think the struggle within people who are coming to grips with this is more palpable than I knew.
And those struggles by scientists themselves, you already mentioned, of course, the head of NIH,
Yeah.
there's the Ken Miller's book, Finding Darwin's God,
Yes.
is
Yeah.
another good example of someone who is, in fact, deeply an evolutionary biologist, but also a
Yeah.
person of faith, and writes about how he has managed to reconcile those two worlds and two identities for himself. And those examples and are exemplars for students and others that
Yeah.
you don't have to go in only one direction. I mean, I know that there's people who do say that, but there's others who don't. So there are people of faith who are scientists, and that's a model for those people who do not want to give up their faith.
They're not incommensurate.
Yeah,
No,
that's right. Well,
not for those people. There's examples.
yeah, let's think about that for a minute. That's kind of Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, NOMA, which I liked as a
Yeah.
strategy. Let's not make this a war of science and religion because, that's not
Yeah.
productive for anybody. And I know Ken Miller. I've read his books. I've hosted him at my lecture series. I've had him on the podcast. I really love Ken. Yeah, I mean, he was one of the pioneers of debunking intelligent design creationism, the whole theory about irreducible
Mm-hmm.
complexity and the
Oh, he was at
bacterial
the trial.
flagellum. He was at that trial. I mean, this, back when I started reading about this bacterial flagellum, I know nothing about this. Like, what is this? Why are they making a big deal about this? And then Ken explained, okay, here's what's going on, and it's like, oh, all right. So, he was the man who debunked that particular argument. But then the last chapter of his book, and, by the way, I'm Catholic. I accept Jesus as my savior. He died for our sins. He was resurrected after the crucifixion and so on. So Ken and I and Richard Dawkins were all at a conference together. And so, Richard, he likes to poke the hornet's nest a little bit. So, he kind of took Ken down this path. Okay, let's say we found a piece of the true cross, the piece of wood, like, was popular in the Middle Ages. Let's say we actually had one. And on the piece of the true cross was a little bit of Jesus's flesh. And we got some of his DNA, and of course he was born of a virgin. So, what would the DNA look like? Could we test this hypothesis of the virgin birth and so on? And Ken just kind of stopped and said, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true, like in a scientific sense. This is just what I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. So I always talk about that story because to what extent would you apply the methods of science to something like the resurrection? Where's the control group? I mean, this is just a story. It's an anecdote. Who was there at the tomb? It was empty, and there was 3 women. No, there were 2 women, different accounts, and so on. And even how that could happen, the virgin birth, how would that happen? Is it parthenogenesis and so on? But I think if you go down that path, you're missing what they mean by it. It's a religious truth, not empirical truth. But then the question is, well, why should I believe it? Is it acceptable to believe something for which you'll never prove it in an empirical sense?
Well, it also does a disservice to science, I think, because science is our understanding of the natural world, and the evidence drives the science. And so I think it does a disservice to say that, science can test and prove the existence or non-existence of articles of faith, or I guess it's a little bit of the Stephen Jay Gould philosophy there, that they're non-overlapping. But if you just really look at those questions of testing, you as a scientist, you need evidence, and you need evidence to test. And so I think science is disserved by trying to cross over into a realm they don't have evidence for. So that's how you kind of can resolve those 2 points. And people's faith serves a different purpose.
Yes.
As Jay Gould has said, there are no moral lessons in nature. So, if you are looking for morality, maybe, there's
Yeah.
different places you can look for that.
Yes, well, but one of the counters to the argument that, if evolution is true, then there's no basis for moral values. Well, yes, there are. Reason. I mean, Enlightenment reason, secular humanism, the civil rights movement, the grounding of rights in natural law or natural rights, or just the proclamation that, by law, here's our Constitution, we guarantee the rights of people. Rights are real. Well, why are they real if there's no supernatural source to verify that they're objective and outside of cultural opinions and relativism? What's the basis? So some of us counter, well, it's actually there in our human nature. We desire to be free. We desire to have autonomy. Would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? It's obvious. Would you rather be dead or alive? Would you rather be healthy or ill? Would you rather be ignorant or knowledgeable? It just go down the line. And it seems to me that's a rational argument that has been made for centuries since the Enlightenment, Spinoza and Kant and Hume and so on, trying to build a foundation of moral values outside of religion. Whether God exists or not is beside the point. Here is the reasons why you should treat others as you would treat yourself, or a sort of a Rawlsian society in which, I don't know which group I'm going to be in, so I want to structure the laws so that they're fair for all groups, something like that. Mm-hmm. That seems to me a basis that, contra to Gould, it's not that they're not overlapping. They are overlapping, and science can. By science, I mean the body of knowledge that philosophy and science has contributed for centuries. I'm not talking about going to the geologist to ask what's the right position on abortion. I just mean the whole collective philosophy, reason, science, rationality, and so on, as an enterprise seems to me a reasonable counter to this, and therefore it's not always non-overlapping.
Well, you can just look to science of behavior. We're psychologists, so we can talk about that. It isn't the case that atheists have no moral values. And in fact, if you look at research on criminality and behavior, atheists are not more criminal than those of faith. In fact, there's evidence they're less likely to be engaged in what we would call immoral and criminal behavior. So you can use science to look at issues like that. And, you can use psychological science to interview atheists, and you will find that the overwhelming number of atheists do have values, as you just articulated what they could be. It isn't that they are completely devoid of values.
Yes, well, the counter to the arguments I just made by a lot of philosophers and scientists who are also atheists is that, well, it's still just a kind of a subjective statement you're making that, yes, in America, we hold these values to be self-evident and our Constitution guarantees them, and we have a police force and a military to enforce them, but that's still not objective. It's not like outside of our culture or our system or our set of laws and norms and customs. To which I counter, well, but psychological scientists like yourselves, you can study what people want. And so human flourishing is our moral foundation. We start there, human flourishing. Now, what can we do to structure society in such a way that humans flourish, and that's pretty obvious. Democracy is better than autocracy, and so on, and having rights versus no rights, and expansion of the moral sphere to include more people. These are just kind of basic arguments that I think are kind of breaching that wall separating is and odd, or the naturalistic fallacy. But I'm in the minority in that position. Most of secular philosophers don't accept that. They still think it's some kind of subjective, just a kind of a given statement, or you can make an argument, but there's nothing outside of that. Like, where do rights come from? Rights are nonsense on stilts, as Bentham famously said. Well, all right, at some point, but you got to start somewhere. And being religious doesn't give you any extra step there. You're just pushing it off to the middleman. That the deity says it's wrong. Yeah, well, which deity? Muslims believe something different than Christians and Jews about certain things. How do you know which one is right? So I don't know. So there it's harder. I tend to think, well, okay, you believe what you want to believe, but there's conflicts, and how science can help resolve those conflicts gets hard.
But back to the idea of flourishing, if you look, hundreds of years ago, society was not flourishing in many ways that it is today. Today, through science, not only science, but through science, we have cleaner water, we have
Yeah.
vaccinations, we have cleaner air. We have a longer life expectancy, although I know it's actually struggling right now. But over those years, science contributed to human flourishing. And so what we want to say is we need to continue to keep science in the foreground, and we want people to understand the benefits of science, right? There are a lot of benefits to improving the life and health
Yeah.
of people in the
Yeah.
planet. And that's why we are concerned about resistance to science. And that's why we wrote the book.
And I think that the demand side of denial that Michael Mann talks about, like what is the demand side? Why is it that denial and doubt and resistance have been sown by corporations and by politicians? And how do we get people to be hyper vigilant about this being used for corporate interest and not for their own well-being? Who is it that wants them to deny and doubt? And why? And who does that serve? It's seldom serving the individual, as we can tell right now, as people are filling the hospitals once again, that somehow being duped to think that this is not real. I don't need to vaccinate. The vaccination is going to be more harmful than actually getting the disease. All the erroneous mythology that people have poured into them it's tragic.
And
Yeah. So,
that
but
misinformation is killing people right now, right? It's the unvaccinated overwhelmingly who are succumbing to COVID right now. So it's really stark that the science misinformation that people are consuming, and don't have the tools that we're trying to provide in the book to fight back. They're
Yeah.
succumbing to it. They're losing their lives to misinformation about the science.
yeah, no one self-identifies as a science denier. If you talk to them, they go, "Well, no, I'm following the science. You're the one that's misinformed." Right? And so
I don't know. I mean, again, having given these talks, there are certainly people who will say, I am the person you're talking about. I don't believe in all of that. I mean, that guy that I met with, he definitely would have said he was a science denier. And I think often, though, what happens is that people are what Lee McIntyre calls cafeteria denialists. They're not blanketly throwing out science. I mean, obviously, there are things that they believe. They probably accept gravity. There are all
Science
kinds of,
deniers
right.
do fly on planes to go visit their
yeah,
grandchildren.
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
But they very carefully pick and choose. Which of these things do I not believe in and why? And often there's some hidden agenda behind that of why they've been persuaded to believe those things.
Well, this is one of the challenges with the mantra, do your own research. I mean, as educators and
Yeah.
researchers, that sounds great. Do your own research. But as we know, what does do your own research mean? For most people, it means Googling it. And we know, due to the way the algorithms are set up, that if you get online and you Google, can, vaccines make you sterile, you're going to get lots of articles popping up saying that they can. So it's unfortunate that do your own research, which sounds great and should be a good thing, really can, through these algorithms and misinformation spread online, really pull people down a rabbit hole. And, if you really think that the vaccine's going to make you infertile, then, it does explain why someone would be hesitant in that case, right? So it's really a matter of these misinformation platforms, like Facebook,
Yeah.
that really have to be more responsible, because people try to find this information and they get misinformation.
And if they have found one article that says this will definitely make you sterile, this will affect your fertility, then the algorithm supports throwing more articles along the same lines. If they like that, now they're going to like all these other articles that say the same thing. And it's just deeply disturbing. I was telling Gale, I had some research students in my lab who I asked to pretend to be certain kinds of people looking for information. Go this week and see what you find if you do that. And so one week it was, did dinosaurs and humans live at the same time? Well, 4 of the top 10 hits said yes. I mean, the major one was the Creation Museum, which had a lot of definitive information about this. And you start to, they were supposed to be pretending to be a 4th grader writing a paper. And they came back and said, I don't know what the kid would do. I don't know how they would sort this information out. Every one of these sites looks just as credible as the other. They've all figured out how to play the game. And one of them said to me, and this is, a senior at Middlebury College, said, but it was a .org site. And what we learned in high school, if it was .org, it was good, And it just broke my heart because I thought we're not doing enough to really train people in how to do that kind of work. And Gale and her colleague Doug Lombardi have come up with some really nice, simple steps of like, here are the things you ought to be asking yourself when you get on these sites. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, and it isn't just the spread of misinformation, right? Because your colleague was finding some true information. In other words, there's something called a COVID rash that very, very few people who get vaccinated get a rash. It isn't
But
a
it
big deal.
exists.
I know someone who had it. It went away in a couple days. She was fine. But if you research that, you will find that that's true. But the problem is the way the media can package these stories is, the old "if it bleeds, it leads" kind of mentality. They push out this one person who got this, rash, or one person who had a heart attack, and it's kind of misrepresenting the proportionality. It's like the old thing of
Yeah.
putting a climate denier and a climate scientist on at the same time as if it's a 50-50 thing. If you're doing research and you're reading true articles, but all the ones you're reading are the bad news, you
Yeah.
don't read about the 600,000 people who
Yeah.
die, and you don't read about the millions of people who've had zero side effects when vaccinated, or just very mild flu-like symptoms for 24
Yeah.
hours. You don't really get to put that proportionality in your head because you see so much of the information that is making it look dangerous. So, as Barbara said, we do have an article about the steps that individuals can take and teachers can take to teach students to properly vet information, like reading like a fact checker, opening up other windows and checking your sources and looking at who those sources are. And of course, a number of steps like that can help. But as Barbara mentioned earlier, that takes some system two processing, right? Because if she's
Yeah.
concerned, your colleague, about heart conditions, and she spends her day Googling that, she'll find a lot of examples, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I want to go back to what Gail's also saying about this false equivalency, this notion that things have to be balanced. And we have seen way too much of that in the media where they think they have to interview somebody with a contrary point of view every time they present something. And we all remember that point in time where every time there was a climate change story, they had to pull a denier out of the wings and interview them. And then, 6 or 7 years ago, the BBC came out with a declaration that said, we're not going to do that anymore. This is as if we were saying, Manchester United, maybe they won, maybe they didn't. Let's ask somebody who thinks they did, and let's ask somebody who thinks they didn't. And so they said, basically, the referee has decided climate change is real, and it's caused in part by human activity. And that's how we're going to present it from now on. And you're no longer allowed to interview a climate denier every time you write a climate change story. And I think we need more awareness of that. There's been a number of really good psychological studies by the Boykoffs on how this idea of balance actually creates bias. So they give people these articles that make it look like, well, some people think this, some people think that, even though they're reporting the statistics of 90% think this and 10% think that. If they've read this balanced sort of approach to it, they're more likely to discount how many people actually agree. And that's what we're seeing as effects of poor public communication of science.
And we know we're not great natural Bayesians, right? We're not,
Right.
great at thinking about conditional probabilities. If any of us here have tried to teach that in our classes, we know, it's a challenge. And so, there's also sort of the motivated reasoning aspect of this, right? So if you are concerned about infertility or COVID rash or heart impacts, and you go online to seek this information, you're more likely to weigh more heavily those articles
Yeah.
confirming your pre-existing belief. And they'll be out there and you'll find them. So that just reinforces, oh, I was right. This
Yeah.
is a major
Yeah.
concern. So it's hard to break out of that loop.
Yeah, the guy that you'd always see on the climate thing was Richard Lindzen from MIT. He was always the guy. And so, one of your recommendations is, if you see the same
Oh,
person every time, but the other side is
yeah.
represented by, 1,000 different guests on the TV show or whatever. I remember Bill Nye was in on one of these comedy talk shows, might have been Jimmy Kimmel or one of those, where they showed a clip of Richard Lindzen saying, "Oh no, the climate science it's not true, and here's why." And MIT, he's from MIT and he's a climate scientist. And then they cut to Bill Nye, and Bill Nye kind of starts to give the reason why he's wrong. And then the kind of the camera pans in a wide angle to show like this whole room full of scientists. And here's what's behind Bill. And who's behind the Richard Lindzen guy? Nobody. He's the only one. Right. So, there's a clue for you as a consumer of knowledge online. If it's just one person or just one group, that what's the one is the Heritage Foundation that's always talking about climate science. And you have 2,000 scientists or 200 climate organizations and 10,000 climate scientists on one side, and the one guy on the other side. That's a clue you should look out for.
Yeah. And the visual representation of that has actually been effective. Gale, was it?
It was John Oliver.
Daily Show, John Oliver.
Yeah, John Oliver.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he brought on 100 people and showed,
yeah, that was it. Yeah.
What does it look
Here
like?
are the 97
are deniers and 98 of them are climate. Yeah. So it is something that people really wrestle with, is those probabilities aren't easy for people to grasp. And the media doesn't do a great job of contextualizing risk. And people have different levels of risk comfort and risk tolerance. And I have a neighbor who is afraid of the COVID rash more than she's afraid of dying of COVID. She won't get vaccinated. And, it sounds, hard to understand, but she works at home. She lives alone. And she has very little contact with other people. And so she's weighing her risks, not in a way I would agree with, but she's weighing her risks. And she's decided she's not going to get vaccinated because she thinks the risk of rash reactions is much higher to her than the risk of dying of COVID. So that's a calculation people make, and it's not one that's always consistent with, population epidemiology.
But have you tried talking to her? Have you tried to talk her out of that? And did you have any success?
I haven't, because she's very committed to her position, and she's not going to shift. And so that's another thing we should talk about, right? So there are extreme, points of view on the right and on the left, and we're often asked, what do you do about those flat earthers? And I'm not sure that they are as movable. We talk about the movable middle in our book. We talk about those people who, like the gentleman Barbara had coffee with, they're smart people, and they have questions, and they're potentially open to change. And there's a lot of people in that movable middle.
And I'll give another example, that when the vaccinations first became available, I had found out about a sign-up thing that was a day ahead of when we thought it would be, called a relative, and he was like, I don't think I'm going to do that. It was very, I have underlying conditions. I'm just not going to get the vaccination. So we had a really good chat, and I talked about, have you talked to your doctor about the underlying conditions and whether that really would prevent you from getting it? And he decided, after we chatted a while, he would make an appointment with the doctor. And the doctor said, oh, because you have these conditions, you definitely need to get vaccinated. You need to do this right away. So one of the things, and he got a vaccination. So one of the things we talk about are epistemic authorities. Who do we trust for knowledge? Who do we trust for expertise? And I think everybody has multiple authorities. So if part of your authorities are Fox News and whatever it might be that might be skewing the information in a negative way, you can talk to that person and say, well, who else do you trust for your health? And there was a piece in the paper this week with a doctor who convinced someone in Tennessee to get the shot. And she said to the patient, you have trusted me with your life for 25 years. I've done surgery on you. I've opened your body up, and you've trusted me. You need to trust me on this one. And the person was like, yeah, you're right. I need to get the shot. But I think we've got to steer people towards other authorities in their life other than deceptive media, disinformation, that kind of thing, and figure out who else do they listen to. I think there have been some pastors in the country who have been beneficial in that regard. Unfortunately, that's not the vast majority. But they know that they're listened to. They know that they're trusted, and if they get up there and talk about it, they may have an effect. And I think there are many people who are quite influential in being persuasive as authorities, and we need to figure out how to marshal them and equip them for these conversations.
Yeah, I've noticed Ben Shapiro, the very popular conservative public intellectual, whose wife is a doctor. He's just been pounding on social media, get vaccinated, and I'm thinking, okay, this is good. Someone on their team, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Now, as a strategy for approaching or talking to somebody like your neighbor, Gale, or not, maybe sometimes it's better just keep your mouth shut. I don't know. Then you get the backfire effect if you. But is it better to ask questions rather than say, here's why you're wrong, boom, boom, boom? Just say, are you sure about that? Or what's your source for that? Or how do you know?
Of course.
Yeah,
it's definitely the case that you want to say, what are your concerns? My niece was initially concerned about her friend told her, her Facebook friend told her that if she gets vaccinated, it causes infertility. And, we talked with her about that and explained why it wasn't true. And my nephew is an infectious disease doctor. So she was, saying, listening to us because we said, well, my nephew says, so we had some authority there that she trusted.
Yeah.
And so she was beginning to warm to the idea. Then her boss told her she couldn't come back to work unless she got vaccinated. That was a big motivator, and she got vaccinated. But now the interesting thing is she is really pro-vaccination, and she's convinced her skeptical friend to also get vaccinated. And the way she did it was she said, go talk to your doctor and find out, because I don't think there is this risk of infertility, but go talk to your doctor. And her friend did. Her friend has now gotten vaccinated.
Oh, wow.
And we know that trust of doctors is high. And they have an important role to play. I mean, I heard a really interesting interview with, somewhere in rural America, where the doctor was taking the time to really listen to every patient. And the one patient was ticking off all the reasons why not. Like, well, those chips they're going to put in my body, that really worries me. And the doctor goes like, here's the needle. See how thin this is? Chips can't go in there. This is this is how it works. And well, I'm worried about all the stem cells that were used because my religion prevents me from having stem cells put in my body. No, that's not how they're made. And just patiently listening to concerns, like being able to really, from an authoritative medical perspective, someone who's trusted by this person for decades, those are the people who can have an impact. But as we know, doctors don't have a lot of time to do all that either. I mean, that's really time consuming.
In other words, you should say, don't take my word for it. Go. Sorry, yeah. In other words, you should ask, instead of say something like, don't take my word for it, just ask your doctor. And then that kind of throws it to somebody who has more authority than you.
Which is what I did, yeah.
Right. We definitely say that. Go ask your doctor. But one thing we should point out is not everyone has a doctor they can go ask. One of the reasons why people are speculating that England has really done a little better right now than us in regards to vaccination rates is because they know who to go to. They have a national system of socialized medicine where they just go to their hospital. They get, they know it's free. They know where to go. In the United States, I have a doctor I can email, but not everyone does. And they don't know where to go. And they don't know if it's going to cost them money. They're worried if they have to show an identification, if they have some, maybe trouble with the law, or they're here without, documentation. So there are a lot of people who can't just go ask their doctor. And so that's unfortunate. And back to the spread of misinformation, they're just listening to the misinformation, perhaps because that's what they only have access to. So I know a lot of communities are trying to reach out to members of key communities who can't just go ask their doctor, so that they can get direct information from trusted allies that's accurate and correct, and helping them to find what they need to get vaccinated.
Yeah, let's talk about when you're not in in a science that there is consensus, evolution, climate science, everybody agrees this is what is true, except for the 2% or whatever that deny it. What if you're in the middle? Let's just wind the clock back to say March of 2020, and it's not clear what we should do. Masks or no masks, social distancing or no, close the economy, don't close the economy, take hydroxychloroquine, don't take hydroxychloroquine. I have a surgeon, doctor friend of mine, world-class surgeon, cyclist friend of mine, so we hang out. And this is when I first heard about hydroxychloroquine. Oh, Shermer, you got to do this. This is it. Here's the study. Sent me some study. I'm like, wow, this guy's a doc. And so I thought, well, okay, yeah, all right. So I tried a dose. And then I came back from a ride, a long ride, so I'm all sweaty. And my wife says, "You stink. You smell like chemicals." I'm like, "Ew, you're right. It's with the hydroxychloroquine." I was like, so this got to have some effect on my body. And, I don't know if it really works for COVID or not. And, so I just stopped. And but there was a little bit of evidence or a few studies it might work. I couldn't. What do I know? Maybe nobody knows. Maybe not even the omniscient Fauci knows, right? Or more recently, just to punctuate this, the ivermectin drug that was used for parasites, and Brett Weinstein. I know Brett. He's a smart guy, PhD in biology and so on, and he's got this popular podcast. And he and his wife Heather, also a biologist, they're talking about this ivermectin is we should talk about this. And all of a sudden, YouTube has demonetized their podcast. Say, well, you can't say this. And then there's an eruption on social media. Is like, why is Google, YouTube deciding what I should read and not read? How do we know that ivermectin works or doesn't work? I don't know. And Bill Maher even made a joke about it. It's a drug. It's not a Republican. Right. So, how do you assess, the claims like that might be true? We don't have consensus yet. We just don't know. Should I pay attention to Brett Weinstein's podcast or not? And to me, it's hard to say when you're in the middle of a uncertain event like this.
Well, as the head of the Skeptic Society, skepticism is probably the most useful at the fringes of scientific knowledge, right? So we, in 2020, in March, didn't know. We didn't have a vast experience with this novel coronavirus. And so your skepticism should probably be the most heightened when information is brand new, not corroborated, not well-founded, and not a lot of evidence. And that's where the skills of the skeptic, I think, come in the most handy.
And Naomi Oreskes in her book, Why Trust Science, talks a lot about it's not any individual study that you want to trust. It's that you want to trust the accumulation of evidence over time, the peer review process, the collective enterprise of science, the way in which science works its magic over time to come up with results that can be trusted, but not one study. I think people are so back to clickbait, what Gale was talking about, so at the mercy of these headline writers of the one quick study. My favorite this past week was Harvard Magazine had a headline for Harvard Magazine online that was eating chocolate early in the morning causes weight loss. This is so amazing. So they were looking at chocolate and weight loss. And if you eat it in the morning, you lose more weight than if you eat it at night. And, there were 19 people in the study, 19 people. I mean, it's just a pathetic little study that got the attention of Harvard Magazine and their headline writers. And yet, I'm not going to rush out and start having chocolate on my toast in the morning on the basis of 19 people in this study. But I think we need to understand what the process is, how long it takes, and how we figure these things out.
And it's interesting because the public, on the one hand, wanted the scientists to figure this coronavirus out in 5 minutes, and was extremely frustrated by the, quote, flip-flopping, back to that idea, of the changing recommendations of public policy around the emerging science. And at the same time, later on, when they did know more, they were skeptical of the overwhelming knowledge. So we have to get public understanding of the nature of science itself, how, like not touching your groceries. Well, it was actually a good idea based on the extremely limited information they had that, other coronaviruses have spread via surfaces. So it was a
Yeah.
hypothesis more than it was
That there might maybe
anything else.
fomites, till we know that it's not fomites, we're
Yeah.
going to do this. Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't portrayed as well as it could have been. And at this point, it's just a hypothesis. That means it's our best guess because we don't have enough evidence, but on the sense of caution, you should do this. And as soon as they found out that that wasn't the case, it wasn't flip-flopping, it was better information about the spread.
And,
The 6 feet
yeah.
thing, that's become, the 6 feet thing is kind of silly now because we know that it's aerosolized and we know that aerosols can travel more than 6 feet. So, people have taken 6 feet as if it's some hard, fast rule. But the 6 feet was really developed when it was thought that it mostly spread through droplets, which really do fall within a shorter distance than aerosol does. And so 6 feet isn't a holy number either.
Right. So the
And
general
I think
rule
we,
is
we cannot forget.
Yeah. So the general rule is to consumers is if there's just one study or two studies, one or two scientists, one or two stories, you just wait. Don't start taking.
Don't base your life on it. No.
Who was that guy that drank the fish chlorine out of his for his aquarium because there was something in the chemical that he had read about that I think Trump even mentioned it. Something. Don't do anything. Just wait.
Don't get your science from politicians is another good rule of thumb.
I mean, I think that's the other thing we can't forget as we look back over the last year and a half. We have to remember what happened in that first year in terms of who was in charge and what the politics were and how much that confounded our misunderstandings of the science. We were not being told everything that the CDC knew or thought, or we were getting it distorted, or we were getting weirdo stuff promoted. Yeah.
But
we
you
have
talk
to
about
remember that it wasn't just straight delivery.
Oh yeah. You talk about in your book absolutism versus multiplism versus evaluativism. Sorry, I bungled those words, but it's a useful heuristic to think about consumers of knowledge that they read about online or on TV. So just kind of walk us through those three different ways of knowing things.
Yeah. So this is a developmental theory about people's beliefs about knowledge and knowing. And again, it's just a useful heuristic. It's not chiseled in stone. But that often individuals can begin with an absolutist view of knowledge. They think that knowledge is right and wrong, black and white. Truth is handed down with certainty. They're the authorities who know it. You take it from them. And if you're a student, you repeat it back verbatim, and that's how you get an A. There's no thinking, no evaluation, none of that involved. And that plays into the hands of an authoritarian government really well, because it's, you trust me, I'll tell you the truth. And anything that falls outside of that, fake news. That really has captured a certain number of people right now in ways that are really problematic. Another sort of developmental phase or another way of thinking about this is multiplism. So some people are multiplist. It's, how do I know? How would I adjudicate these claims? They could all be right. And that's the post-truth kind of world that we're living in right now as well. There are a lot of politicians happy to have multiplist under their sway as well as absolutists, because if they think that it's all just up for grabs, it's not even worth bothering to try to figure any of this stuff out. But the stage that people talk about, and it fits with everything we think about in good education, is what we think of as evaluativism. You're teaching people to evaluate knowledge and evidence and to try to adjudicate truth claims in ways that are moving more towards a sense of what is actually reliable and valid. And unfortunately, in any of the studies that have been done, that's a fairly small percentage of the American public that can actually do that. And we have to do a better job in our schools of teaching people how to use those processes. In many ways, it's back to old critical thinking. How do we get people, again, I love your use of the word term skeptical, because it fits with everything we think about promoting functional skepticism. How do we promote functional skepticism? How do we get people to have a healthy view towards it? And how do we get them to then use these processes to evaluate what they're reading?
And the good news is there are instructional strategies you can use even with elementary school kids, middle school kids. My colleague Doug Lombardi and I have worked on getting kids to evaluate two models of climate change. One that is a scientific model, and one is a sort of climate skeptic model, but not in a rational skeptic way, but in a I don't believe climate change. I'm going to say it's increased solar radiation, right? And kids are given these two models. They're not told which is the one that's scientifically sound, and they're given pieces of evidence, and they're asked to evaluate the evidence against the model themselves. And when they do that, they find, of course, that the evidence does in fact support the model of human-induced climate change. So middle school kids can do this. So we're not sure if politicians can do it, but middle school kids can do it, and adults can definitely weigh this evidence and become, as Barbara said, more evaluative rather than just accepting what anyone says to be true, or accepting that nobody has any ideas about what is valid from a scientific standpoint. You can evaluate it, but it doesn't mean just Googling it. It means literally weighing the actual evidence against competing models and looking at which one has the most support behind it, which is really the process of science. So we need to be teaching the process of how science is conducted. We don't need to be teaching science as a collection of facts which change over time as more evidence comes out.
Yeah, you talk about the research in your book about to what extent Americans understand scientific facts, like that the Earth goes around the sun and so forth. And we don't score too well on those tests compared to other countries. So we seem to have a lack there. But worse than that, it's not just science facts. It's how does it even work? How do you start teaching that to children?
Well, the next generation science standards, which is the recommended standards for teaching science in the United States, recommended, not required, because we, as you know, don't have national education standards, recommends that you teach kids these processes and practices, like I just mentioned, of evaluating evidence, asking questions, testing hypotheses, looking at two theories against one another. So the kinds of activities you can do, even with very young kids. We've done some of this in our research team with kindergartners and large-scale studies in large school districts, diverse school districts in LA. And we find that kids can learn the basic steps and processes of how to adjudicate knowledge and become more evaluativists. It's not going to happen in kindergarten, but if you teach this from the beginning, by the time they're in middle school, high school, and definitely college, of course they can do this. But what we know is, science isn't always taught like that. Teachers in elementary school don't have a lot of science training themselves, don't teach a lot of science anymore because they don't have the training, and also because they're pressured to teach literacy and math, because that's what we mostly test in the United States. So we're not really, we're not really teaching kids with and giving them the tools they need to become scientific reasoners and thinkers.
Yeah, we have this favorite line we like from Lee McIntyre, the philosopher of science, who talks about teaching a scientific attitude. And I think that transcends even subject matter. I mean, a scientific attitude in his way of thinking is the idea of valuing evidence and then being willing to change your mind in light of new evidence. And I think that's fundamentally what I would want school kids to know. I want them to value evidence. I want them to learn how to discern it. And I want them to be open to changing their mind if they see evidence that contradicts what they already think, know, or believe. And I've worked really hard on that in teaching. It's just such a fundamental kind of premise. But I think the other thing that Gale and I've also found in a lot of our research is that there are some fundamental misconceptions about science. And one of them that fascinates us is there's the primacy of the scientific method. So kids learn that you do a controlled experiment. You've got two groups, a control group, people randomly selected. You've got a hypothesis. You go in and you test this stuff. But a good part of science, all the field sciences, don't work that way. And so then Gale and I coincidentally both did studies years ago when Pluto got demoted to dwarf planet status. We were both interviewing children about what they thought about this. And children were angry and upset. And how could scientists possibly know that? And one of mine said, they couldn't possibly know that unless they go there. And they haven't been to Pluto. They're just, they'd have to go to Pluto and do an experiment to find that out. I mean, that's how scientists are supposed to know things. And so all the kinds of inferences that we make from the the ways we abstract, the way we infer, the way that we think about how do we know what's going to happen with climate change. That's not a controlled experiment. And so there are people who don't trust it, which is bizarre, but that's part of what happens in science education. We're not teaching about all the ways scientists know what they know.
Yeah, one of the principles I like to teach is the convergence of evidence, the so-called consilience of inductions, as William Ewell called it, convergence of evidence of independent lines of inquiry. So in the case of evolution, you have paleontologists, geologists, geneticists, comparative anatomists, and on and on and on. And it's not like these guys are all meeting on the weekends to get their stories straight against the creationists. They don't even know each other. They don't publish in the same journals. They publish in different journals, and they go to different conferences and so on. And they all converge. Same thing with climate scientists. The guy studies glaciers, and the woman that studies ecology, and this person studies sea level rise. And so they don't know each other. Different science, independent lines of inquiry, and they all. So this is how I evaluate claims that I hear that I know nothing about. I'll just kind of look to see if there's some convergence of evidence to some conclusion that most of the experts, like I get a lot of stuff about quantum physics and consciousness and all the woo-woo stuff, and it's like, I don't know anything about quantum physics, but I can call my scientist friends who study quantum physics. That's what they do. And is there any way this could be true? I mean, do you guys know for sure this is not true? Oh yeah, here's how we know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, then I don't need to worry about this. Now, it's not to say that person that sent me the article I know for sure is wrong. Sometimes the outsiders can be right. It's just very rare. And then that study on the 97% figure of climate scientists, this is bandied about. It's not a argument from authority. Oh, look, the authorities all say it's right, so I have to go along. No, it's that the 97% of papers published on climate science converge independently to this conclusion. Yes. Well, what about the 3%? So Naomi Oreskes points out, well, they don't converge to anything. It's sunspot activity, it's volcanic activity, it's orbital eccentricities, and so on. They don't converge to anything. So that tells me they're probably not right. Not 100% sure. They could be right, but probably not in a Bayesian kind of way.
Right. Yeah, good example.
Right, and the goal of a scientist is not to confirm what everybody else knows. We're academics, and that's not how you get published, and that's not how you get tenure, and that's not how you get promoted. A scientist likes to come up with new discoveries, things on the edge, and so. Obviously, this mythology that all scientists just go along with the received point of view, that isn't how it works. People would love to find out new mechanisms, find out new ideas, and those are the ways to make a new name for yourself and to be notable in science. So there's a inherent desire within the scientific community to find new knowledge, not just to confirm what we already know. That can go both ways, though, right? Because you can, get the one study and you can be very excited, and your university can publicize that one study. But then we're back to Barbara's example of, eat chocolate for breakfast, and that's probably not best. But it does provide motivation for scientists to look for new information, not just to confirm what we already know.
Well, let's kind of bring this around to talking about some of actionable recommendations you want to leave listeners with. Your book, the reason I really loved your book is because half of it is like, here's a list of things you could do as an educator, as a consumer, as a politician, whatever. So just kind of, both of you, just kind of what should listeners be thinking about? What can we take? How do I talk to crazy Uncle Harry? How do I deal with politicians? My coworkers say this or that. What should we do?
Well, we'll affirm again that, part of what you want to do is have an open, warm conversation where you are spending a lot of time listening and where you're trying to really hone in on the concerns, the values. You can also steer them, as we've said, towards other sources of authority, have people go talk to a doctor or whatever. You obviously can also provide some of the facts that maybe contradict what they think, but in a gentle, caring way. I mean, a lot of it is being empathic for understanding that people are confused and there are reasons why they might believe what they believe. And it is easy to get pulled down those rabbit holes of the algorithms on the internet and the filter bubbles that affect people's lives. So that would be one general strategy. Gale?
And I'm
You were
glad
going
you
to,
brought that up because one of the reasons we wrote the book is that a lot of people know that we're concerned about science mistrust and the fading values for what science can actually bring us as a society. But what we didn't see a lot about out there is what can we do about it? And that's a real focus of our book, as you mentioned, is we don't want to just say this is a problem and our hair's on fire about
yeah,
it. We want to say everyone can do something about it. One of my favorite things that someone said to us just recently was, I'm going to buy your book and not recommend it to my science denier cousin, but give it to my science denier cousin
yeah, yeah,
and ask him if he'll read it.
yeah,
Another person read the book and said, I have a science denier friend and I've stopped talking to her, but I've found through reading your book that maybe I could start up conversations with
yeah,
her again.
yeah,
And these kind of comments make us feel really encouraged because the worst thing we can do is, cordon off the scientific reasoners and thinkers from the rest of
yeah,
society. That's
yeah,
terrible. We want to broaden participation in science. We want to broaden people's utility value for science. You can use science in your everyday life to figure out why the TV won't work or your car's not running right, or you can use science in your everyday life, and we want everyone to be able to do that. So we want to broaden that participation. So we hope we have strategies in there that people can find useful.
I think the other thing that I want to make sure to say is that we don't think these solutions are just individual either. So I've been, again, encouraged by what I've seen some of the social media sites do to try to stop misinformation and disinformation about science. So Pinterest in 2019 found that they were the largest site of anywhere for anti-vax information. And that became disturbing internally. And they decided to anytime somebody searched for anti-vax information, they got an immediate link to the American Pediatric Association, the World Health Organization, and the CDC with all the truth about vaccinations. And Twitter did the same thing. And then Twitter also started this policy of if you try to forward something but you haven't read it yet, you'll get a little blurb that says, would you like to read this first before you forward it? Small nudges that happen at the social media level can make an enormous difference. I mean, Facebook has certainly not been as willing to step into that. They seem to let things be a little less regulated, but to their detriment. I mean, it's really been problematic the degree to which people, and I saw this study the other day, the people who get most of their news on Facebook are the ones least likely to want to vaccinate. I mean, that's just really distressing. But we need to also have strategies at a higher level that are going to help us confront science denial and make sure that it doesn't breed even further.
And for your listeners who are probably majority science acceptors, what I would say is we in that community, we need to just stop calling everyone who questions science, stupid. A lot of these people, as Barbara said, can
Yeah,
be very intelligent, but have been misled. And back to these structural issues, it isn't, necessarily individual people's fault if they have questions about science. There's
yeah,
good reason
yeah,
for them to have those questions. They either are very legitimate questions or they've been fed misinformation, and those structural issues. We need to respect that, and we need to understand how they have been misled and be, like Barbara said, empathetic. Because often it is,
yeah,
it isn't we don't want to blame individuals. Um, we want to understand why we can all be susceptible to this and what we can all do to lessen that
yeah.
susceptibility to misinformation and science doubt and resistance.
Yeah, and I just want to affirm what Gail's saying. We don't want to write off people who aren't right there with us all the time. We want to think about how can we be influential. And I'll go back to the first example I gave of this woman in the news the other day who said, well, I was skeptical for a long time, but that's one thing. I don't want to be ignorant. I want to stay skeptical, but not ignorant. And so now I'm going to get vaccinated because I realized it does not affect my fertility. And then we need to remember there are a lot of people like that who are still in the wings right now trying to decide but getting very frightened by what they see happening in their communities. And we don't want to further polarize them in any way. We want to help them sort out the information that's accurate and make an informed decision.
Yeah, that's perfectly said. Good way to wrap it up. I mean, the subject's always been important to me, but in the middle of a pandemic, wow, now it's, your work comes at the most perfect opportune time when it's most needed. Thank you for your work. Thanks for coming on the show.